Let's talk about the concept of fixing the past. It's an extraordinarily popular fantasy of going back in time and fixing something, making some correction that is needed. It's probably the main theme of all time travel stories is fixing the past. The first time that I can recall running across the concept applied to real history was in John Belair's book, The Trolley to Yesterday. John Belair's was a young adult writer of supernatural themed stories, horror stories, ghost stories, stories about warlocks and the occult, and he was unusually good at it. I believe he wrote about a dozen of them, and then he sadly died, and his estate continued having these stories written. So look for the ones that he wrote himself. I'm sure they're better. Those have someone continue after the original author dies almost never works out. I'm sure there's exceptions, but I doubt that's one. Anyway, in John Belair's stories, there's usually a 12-year-old type boy character who goes on these sort of supernatural adventures with an adult who's like an eccentric friend or uncle or relative or something like that. And in this one, The Trolley to Yesterday, Johnny Dixon, who's one of the main characters, and a character who I think is called Professor Childermass, accidentally wind going back in time almost 800 years to the sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. This is in the year 1204. The Fourth Crusade was announced, and the crusade formed and made it to the city of Venice in Italy, where they went heavily into debt to the Doge of Venice, the leader of the city, who was called Henry Dandolo. Henry Dandolo did this on purpose. He got them in debt. Venice was the city you had to go to if you wanted to get to the Holy Land, which, is the goal of the Crusades. They're going to free the Holy Land or extend Christian dominion in the Holy Land or what have you. And they go to Venice and they need to get passage, but Henry Dandolo isn't going to give it free, and he gets them in debt. And then he says, "Look, I'll give you passage to the Holy Land, but I want you to come attack Constantinople with me." Constantinople at this time is the largest Christian city in the world, but it's not Catholic Christian, it's Eastern Orthodox Christian, which is, the great schism, the breach in Christianity that continues to this day. But it was like the largest, they were Christians, is my point. And so for the crusade, which was designed to spread Christianity, to suddenly switch to attacking the largest Christian city in the world, which Venice was in a trade rivalry with over the Mediterranean trade from the east, is perverse and really, really, really sad. But they agree to this, and it works. They break into Constantinople, and they sack the city. Sacking means, of course, taking everything that isn't nailed down. And sadly, for inter-Christian faith history, they behave really badly and kill, it's thought, a couple thousand people, which, remember, the world population was so much smaller in 1200. A couple thousand people is quite a lot, especially when it was done with swords and arrows and spears right in front, men, women, and children. And in one of the more horrible instances of this, they invaded a church. Churches, of course, back then had a lot of wealth in them. They had valuable altar cloths and ornaments, so they were looking for wealth to take away with them, the Crusaders. But there were a bunch of people in there who had taken refuge, and they slaughtered them. So Professor Childermass tells Johnny all of this, and their main goal is simply to get back home. They didn't come as, it came sort of by accident. They didn't come as part of a quest or as an attempt to stop some evil villain. At least that's not my memory. My memory is they just went into the past by accident. They're, of course, paralleling another one of the most famous time travel stories of all time, Back to the Future. Back to the Future is partly, I think, one of the reasons that it's so popular and it's so great is that it's just trying to redress an accident. Marty wasn't trying to do anything by going in the past. It was just a technical problem. And it is just a technical problem to be solved in that. They have to first correct the changes that Marty has made in the past to his future, and of course they wind up accidentally improving his future. Or maybe accidentally is the wrong word there. Unintentionally. They unintentionally improve Marty's future by trying to make sure that his parents meet and that he gets born and so on. And but essentially they're just trying to solve a complex technical problem. And there aren't many movies like that. There aren't many stories like that that get really popular. And I think that's partly responsible for the movie's continued popularity. Is it really appeals to people who see life as a series of technical challenges and aren't that interested in stories about antagonism. They like firm rules that govern plots and characters trying to manipulate within those rules to achieve the best possible outcome. In the John Belair's story, they're just trying to get home. And in the course of trying to get home, Professor Childermass uh, is in this church that in real history was invaded by the sacking crusaders and where many people were killed in the course of the sack. And he's seen and he sees this happening. He's like high up in the rooftops inside the church, and he has a flare gun. He brought it from the future, and he sets off a flare as the crusaders break in, and it terrifies them. As you know, one might expect, this is similar to those scenes in cheap movies where the heroic explorers from like Our Time and Place meet some primitive tribe and show them like a compass or a magnet or something, and it stuns them and they become afraid. This is like that. And he disrupts, temporarily at least, for just that moment. He saves the the Byzantine folks, the civilians who are hiding in the church in Constantinople, and it's left open in my memory whether he has altered history, whether he did actually save those people, even if obviously couldn't stop the sack of Constantinople generally. If he saved those people in that church, I believe it's left open in the story. Um, he may have saved them. Perhaps the Crusaders came back once they got over their fright, and when he was gone, they proceeded to sack the church and killed the people they would have killed anyway. But it was a dramatic moment because it raises the. First, it was just good storytelling. It's a really fun story. All of Blair's stories are pretty good, but I remember that one as being exceptionally fun because there was no antagonist. There was no evil warlock they were trying to stop or some ghost they were trying to stop. They were just trying to get home from this massive occult time travel accident. Um, but it also raises the ethical issue of if you could travel into the past, and what would fixing the past actually look like? What would be the ethics involved in fixing the past? One of the more time travel focused pop culture things that has focused on this, of course, is Doctor Who. Oh, hang on 1 second. My kid wanted to tell me something. Okay, back to Doctor Who. So in Doctor Who, the main character is a Time Lord and has a vehicle that lets him travel anywhere in time and space that he desires. So one of the questions that occasionally occurs to people is, what can the Doctor fix? Can the Doctor fix history? Can he... It's usually a he, although he's been played by a woman, so forgive me. Can he shift tragedies? Could he stop horrible events? They generally imply, of course, no, because the obvious follow-up, if the answer were yes, it would change everything. If the answer were yes, then why isn't the Doctor doing that constantly? Why doesn't he get a big computer and sort of chart out the cause and effect relationships and figure out the simplest ways to prevent horrible things like the sack of Constantinople in 1204, or the assassination of John F. Kennedy, or World War One? Why stop? Why doesn't he sort of prevent the Homo sapien race from wiping out the Neanderthals? If that is indeed what happened, I'm sure that people disagree. But basically, once you allow the Doctor to use the implications of his power, there's kind of no end to it. He would sort of be ethically committed, and he is generally an ethical character, often a very dedicated ethical character. He would be ethically committed to sort of fixing our past. So, in order to get around this, the show has generally either limited his power um, by having him not be fully in control of the ability to time travel, or by providing powerful antagonists to interfere with his efforts to fix the past, but more often by resorting to the concept that some things that happen are fixed. They are fixed points, and he cannot alter them. They don't really give a good reason for this in the lore. It's just something like Time Lords know this, that there are some things that are just fixed and cannot be altered. There's plenty that can be altered. Usually, when the Doctor visits the past, it is to rectify some incursion into the past by other um, people from the future, or aliens, or other time traveling villains like the Master, one of his big antagonists. And it's sort of like he's keeping the past the way it was, perhaps with some small improvements. But in general, events are fixed. Uh, there's an episode in the David Tennant years, I forget exactly which, but they deal with this very. It's in the fourth series, the one with Donna. They go to Pompeii on Volcano Day, which is a joke that the David Tennant Doctor had made earlier. Is like, don't go to Pompeii on Volcano Day. So they actually do it. They go to Pompeii on Volcano Day. Pompeii was a good choice because, of course, it's a terrible thing that happened, but it wasn't the result. It was just a natural disaster. The volcano erupted and thousands of people were killed. The implication is that even though the Doctor presumably has access to all sorts of futuristic science fictional technology, that this is something that is out of his control. Even should he wish to stop Pompeii, the character isn't so powerful that they can stop a volcanic eruption. Although, given a time machine, he could go into the future, he could find someone who knows how to stop a volcano. Whatever, that's generally pretty far from the viewer's mind. So the implication is then, okay, you know that a horrible disaster is coming. What should you do? Should you warn people? Should you spread the word? No, essentially, is what it comes to over the course of the episode. Although Donna, his human companion, does challenge him to break his rule about not disturbing a fixed point. He's established Pompeii as a fixed point. You can't change fixed points. And Donna does at least get him to bend the rules enough to save one family. And although this seems like sort of just, an act of general mercy, because we've gotten to know these people over the course of the episode, and we like the idea of them being saved. We like the idea that he's saving at least a few people from this disaster. It does open up the door, which is, if one family, why not two? If two families, why not 5, 10? Why not everybody? Why not get your time machine floating over the city of Pompeii for hours, just blaring out warnings? If you can't actually stop the eruption, why not at least get everybody out, or use advanced technology to transport them all, or pull them out of the lava flow, or what have you? Because if you could fix the past, why not? Why wouldn't you? It's generally, if people at that time had that the foreknowledge and the ability, they would have done their best to achieve this, and it's generally seen as an ethical imperative to save life in a natural disaster. Why wouldn't you do that? And I think the reason that Doctor Who doesn't want to explore these questions too thoroughly and resorts to this idea of the fixed past, and in general they don't set a lot of stories in the past, the actual human past, because I think it's expensive, and you don't have as much freedom to carve the world because there's too much knowledge about the actual past, and this is the bigger reason, there's too much disputed knowledge about the past, about what fixing the past would look like. Because once you start, we can generally agree that it would have been a good thing if more people had been saved from a volcanic eruption in Pompeii. Or say if more people had survived the Lisbon earthquake. But those are natural events that were not the result of any human malignity. And while they're the kind of thing that Superman would do if he existed, he would go in time and he would save people from natural disasters. But what about the elements of history? What about the tragic events of history that are caused by people, like the sack of Constantinople? If you could fix the past, if you were the Doctor, should you go back in time and stop Henry Dandolo from unleashing the Fourth Crusade upon Constantinople? Should you, I don't know, blackmail him, put him to sleep at a key moment in the, or just kidnap him? That would be. I'm sorry, I'm just imagining that episode. That would be so great if the Doctor just sort of started building a time prison and going around history kidnapping bad actors, and they made them stay in these cells for like a week or something, and then dropped them once the danger was over. Once the Crusaders had left, he's like, "Okay, Henry Dandolo, you can go back now." Because of people disagree about what fixing the past would look like. If through saving Pompeii, let's say, saving the people of Pompeii and Herculaneum, if some of those people who are saved would have altered the course of history, and which seems likely, there were a lot of them, if they would have changed the outgrowth of the Roman Empire, things get pretty complicated pretty fast. What if they had kept the Western Roman Empire going a little longer before the arrival of the Germanic tribes that eventually went on to form feudal Europe? What if they had had it collapse sooner? What if they had prevented the movement of the empire east? You can see why the possibilities to scale up so quickly into infinity, that fixing the past would essentially be an artistic operation. What if it had turned out to be a good idea, with the Doctor's knowledge of how humanity is going? What if it would have turned out to be a good idea to kill Columbus before he ever made his voyages, for example? What if 50 or 100 years more before transatlantic contact took place would have been really, really good for humanity? What if you had done more complex interventions? What if you had, say, brought vaccines into existence centuries before they did? What if you had provoked scientific thought? There's really no end to the idea of fixing history, but it does tell us a lot about what we wish for the future, because our past is our lens for viewing desirable futures. So those who would have, say, wanted the people living in the Western Hemisphere before Columbus to have survived better, to have provoked a greater challenge to European colonial power, they would be possibly on board with the idea of killing Columbus before his voyages. Or, just, I don't know, maybe if you don't want to be so violent, you could do it more subtly, right? You could, like, frame him for fraud. I'm imagining a fixing time squad, a fixing the past squad that tries to get these things done as artfully as possible. There's an Isaac Asimov novel called The End of Eternity that sort of imagines the same thing. There's like a squad from the future, a large organization called Eternity, which is sort of continually tinkering and fixing human history in certain ways. It doesn't spoil the book. It's quite good. I would say it's actually his best novel. It has great tone, and it doesn't spoil to say, of course, this whole enterprise turns out to be flawed. The whole idea of fixing the past turns out to have wider repercussions, because it sort of stops you from looking into the future. If you're kind of focused on fixing the past rather than grappling with present problems leading to the better future, the past is our lens for visualizing future problems, but it should not be the only evidence we use when assessing what to do right now. We need more than knowledge of the past. We need ideals. We need a sort of artistic vision of the utopia that we want our present day efforts to move towards. But fixing the past is a really dramatic, romantic idea, and of course, it makes for great storytelling. Doctor Who, a little after the Pompeii episode that I just discussed, Doctor Who got a big kerfluffle. It got a lot of attention and excitement going among its fans with just the title of one episode. They did a season. This is with the next actor who played the Doctor, Matt Smith, when the show was being run by Stephen Moffat, and they sort of split their season in half. And the last episode of the first half of the season ended with some text on the screen that says, like, the Doctor will return in "Let's Kill Hitler." Just the title of the episode. I don't think there was even any clips from the episode. It was just the title, and the title got tremendous excitement. I think partly just because it's a great title. It's so casual. Let's kill Hitler. Like, let's go down to the shops. But also, it fits one of the fundamental fictional elements of time travel, which they hadn't really used in Doctor Who much, was, what if you could just go kill Hitler? If you asked people if they could intervene with the past and what they would do, I would guess that killing Hitler would be like the number one answer that you'd receive, at least top 10 in this part of the world. Enormous numbers of people would like to be there and stop Hitler. I'm thinking of Mel Brooks about how he felt it was his life mission to make people laugh at Hitler because that was one way you could get back at him. But there's tremendous numbers of people who would who felt denied revenge. And that's what that episode wound up being about. Of course, it turns out to be kind of like a clever contrivance, and the characters don't literally kill Hitler, but it's feeding that fantasy. Similar to how in Raiders of the Lost Ark, when Indiana Jones is squaring off with these Nazis and their faces are literally melted off. It was sort of like the death is too good for these people. He cheated us by ending his life before he could be punished, and we want to punish him posthumously. So in the time travel device, you get to enjoy that fantasy of punishing the people who time and history have shown to be monsters and to have deserved worse treatment than they ever got in reality. One of the more subtle versions of the fixing the past is the work of historical fiction generally, is what side would you have been on? Historical fiction often offers the pleasures of this kind of time travel fantasy of fixing the past, not so much by fixing real events, but by taking the reader's mind into characters who struggle with the problems and react to the issues of their history in ways that the readers would like to think that they would have done as well. So if you were, say, transported back to the 30s, you like to think that you would have recognized the ongoing threat of the Nazis, and even more than that, you like to think you would have done something about it. Perhaps if you had, been in the Russian Revolution, you would have noticed what danger the Bolsheviks posed to Russia and the world generally, and you would have done something about it. So fiction can give you some of this fixing the past pleasure by telling you something about yourself. You would have noticed, you would have helped, you would have made some effort to be on what turned out to be the right side of history. Because, of course, in the present, where the future is locked away from us, we cannot be 100% sure that we're on the right side of history. We can only guess. But if we were to be pushed into the past and to look forward, you can be reasonably sure. There's a story by the science fiction writer C.M. Kornbluth where this fantasy is lived out slightly differently, but these guys are working on the Manhattan Project, and they've completed their work, and one of them is imagining what will happen if these bombs are used on Japan, and another has an extended reverie where he's transported to a fictional future where Japan and Nazi Germany won the war, kind of like Man in the High Castle, and he sees how lousy it would be, and then he's returned to his present, and the next time that this character who he's talking to wonders if they're making the right choice by using these bombs against Japan, he just sort of goes, yeah, this time we do know. We know that we're doing the right thing. Kornbluth wrote this after the bombs were dropped, of course, but it confirms the sense we would like. If we had the evidence from the future of the implications of our actions, if we had just some of it, it would help our decision making now. The earlier fantasy that I mentioned, the one about before it was totally obvious to everyone how dangerous the Nazis were, that you would have noticed earlier, this is the main thing that the spy writer Alan Furst offers to his readership. Alan Furst is a darn good writer and has written, I think, more than a dozen of these historical spy stories or covert action stories, secret political struggle stories. They're mostly set in the 30s or the early 40s, from about 1933 to 1942. He's written them for quite a while, and they're a lot of fun. I would say the best ones are probably the first two, Night Soldiers and Dark Star, just because they're a little bit longer and they get to do a little wider treatment of the politics of the era, and the stories and the plots are a little more ambiguous and tonally complex. But they're all pretty good fun. I remember learning about them through a short review of his work by Julia Keller in the Chicago Tribune, and I had never heard of him before, but I had one of those powerful instinctive responses you sometimes get when you hear about a piece of work or you read a review of a piece of work. It's like, I will get into this. This is good. I got to seek this out. You should always trust those impulses, even if they seem weird, even if it's directing you to like something you're really pretty sure that you don't like or care about. If you have the impulse, just go with it. See where it leads you. You'll get wonderful outcomes that way, or at least unusual ones that just say yes. It's kind of like the old rule in improv comedy. Just say yes. Say yes. Someone wants you to go to a new restaurant. Just say yeah, sure. Do the same with any piece of work. And that's what led me to Alan Furst. And I had a blast reading Alan Furst. And over time, of course, it became apparent that the main thing he was offering, aside from pretty good storytelling and character development and really excellent research into the real history of sort of subterranean political warfare before World War II, covert action during World War II, intelligence work, kind of all of that stuff that doesn't pop into the standard history textbooks very often. Furst has researched all of this, and although he does not use real people often, it happens, but it's rare, he uses real milieus very well. So if he sets a character in a setting where, say, they're part of the underground that's trying to create newspapers that will give people in Italy the real news about what's going on instead of the fascist propaganda, you can be reasonably confident that something like that really was going on, even if he's made fictional characters carry the weight of that thing. And it became apparent, though, that the real pleasure that the stories offer is this idea that you would have been heroic if you had been in that time and place and given the opportunity to participate in the struggle. You would have been. None of the characters in his books have to participate in these underground operations, usually against Nazi power or fascist power, generally sometimes against the Soviet Union. None of them have to do this. They're sort of independent enough that it's a consequence of their choices. They choose. They risk. They're usually people with something to lose. They usually have a decent position or a job, and they have to take some kind of risk. And in order to engage in this, and that you would have done that. You would have seen before most of the world, before it was obvious, before your society or yourself were directly under threat, you would have seen the importance of opposing these people. and then given the opportunity to do so secretly, you would have done it. And then of course you get the pleasure of all the sort of secretive stuff that spy stories let you enjoy, like, code phrases and secret meetings and not knowing who your friends are and not knowing what your enemies might be surveilling and this kind of stuff. And all of that's done totally fine, and the plots are good, and you'll like them. There's also usually a romantic subplot, kind of like in Casablanca, where the rediscovery of your willingness to fight for what's right is linked to the rediscovery of, or the new discovery of love, and so you get watch these characters have kind of passionate, intense, usually very quick too, sort of wartime romances. You get a lot of that fun as well. These are fun books. You'll like them. I think he's still writing them. I don't think he stopped. I just haven't picked any up lately. But I'm pretty sure he's still working on it. And the main thing, though, and this is the other thing I noticed, the main thing, though, is that the people in these books are fairly, the protagonists, the ones who draw the reader in, who are the reader's stand-in, the ones whose pleasures you're expected to share. These are a fairly small set of human beings who were alive at that time. They are usually people who have managed to stay unmarried, and especially without children. They're usually people who are old enough to be sort of experienced and worldly, but not so old that they can't improvise or face physical challenges. They're usually in like their late 30s or 40s, similar to the heroes of, say, John Buchan's thrillers, or the Alfred Hitchcock movies in the 30s, like The 39 Steps or The Lady Vanishes, Foreign Correspondent, Casablanca, of course. These are the characters who are experienced, but they are not so invested in the institutions of their lives that they can't imagine making a move. They can imagine taking independent action. They can imagine shifting things around, and they have the experience and the resources and the connections, because they're reasonably sophisticated, to do this. They also tend to be in professions that prize knowledge and where their activities allow for a certain independence of movement without anyone thinking anything of it. So a filmmaker, journalists, there are at least 2 journalists who are the main characters, police officers, intelligence officers, soldiers, people who have managed to stay independent and yet successful in a sort of difficult, unusual profession. This is not the mass of humanity. This is not most people. Most people are simply not in the position to take this sort of independent action against a distant threat, distant either in space or in time. And most of us, faced with the kind of challenge that Nazi Germany represented, where the fundamental institutions of a society were in the hands of evil people, the fundamental institutions are too strong and all-encompassing for most of us to do much about it. I feel sort of the weight of that hitting me just saying it, but I think it's sad to say, but it's true. There's not a lot of room to get to grips with them. Sometimes it's simply physically difficult to find any space away from them, but more often it's just how do you get at them? So the characters in Furst's books are independent, but they can't operate against the forces they want to oppose without the help of some counter institutions. So normally, one of my favorites is, I think it's called The Foreign Correspondent, and probably an intentional callback to the Hitchcock movie from 1940, which is one of his really fun early ones, black and white, is a journalist who is part of the Italian underground against Mussolini, but not really able to maintain the effort until they make a contact with British intelligence. and they become part of this larger organization. It's like by taking independent action, they sort of make themselves known to the organizations on the other side, which then reach out to them, recruit them, give them work to do, some way of putting their opposition into effective action. And the actions that the characters offer in Furst books, the actions that characters pursue are meaningful. I don't want to undercut the importance of like sort of covert ops and intelligence and this kind of thing. And Furst isn't like some he isn't. One thing that like sort of these historical adventure writers do if they're kind of lazy is they overplay the importance of the actions the characters do. Sometimes they give them credit for very specific real life victories or achievements. Furst doesn't do that. He implies that it's important, but not that it like changes everything. You know, a really good successful mission in an Alan Furst book might deprive the bad guys of like, you know, a specific technical service that they wanted at that moment, or remove one skilled officer from the Nazi intelligence service, or slow down access to a supply route for like a few days. And yes, it's one of the, so it's more like these little actions. What matters is a lot of them. A lot of little actions. A lot of people doing the right thing and opposing villainy add up to victory with a capital V. And Furst's pleasure is more that it was their choice. People were choosing of their conscience and their sense of what's right in the world to do this. Sometimes these characters are driven to do this by duty, but they almost always go beyond what duty would ask because they feel the rightness of it. Occasionally someone stops and gives a little speech about how if they didn't do this kind of thing they would be sullied or dishonored, but more often it's left unspoken. It's just understood that conscience demands that you oppose villainy and do what you can to frustrate evil, or at least to help the good guys a little bit. And that's probably the big question is, yes, some people were driven by conscience to oppose the Nazis, either when they were under occupation or when they're ahead of where their societies were. You know, there were volunteers from neutral powers or from countries not yet at war, ahead of people who were sort of ahead of the curve, as it were. And First book offers you the chance to be one of them, and to be one of them who joined the fight for like the sort of most ennobling reason. But more often, it was in response to direct threats to society, people feeling their own interests and their safety and security threatened. That's what provokes opposition. The conscience-driven are sort of like a small, heroic minority, and it's lovely to imagine joining such a group and seeing ahead of the curve and getting in the fight early. But in real history, what drives opposition is the need to defend direct interests. Is that too negative? We know there are heroes out there. We'd like to be one of them sometimes. Not all the time. We'd like to be heroes in sort of a safe way. We'd like to join a little conscientious, heroic minority fighting for the good, being on the right side of history, and eventually vindicated. First books provide that. They're heroes of conscience stories. And they end before things usually get too bad. In real life, of course, people who participate in underground covert action, especially in Nazi-occupied countries, were caught often and killed. There were reprisal raids. It could be pretty grim. And First books end before they get to that point. I can't think of any one of his where the protagonist is caught and died, where they have that scene, perhaps, like from a movie like Army of Shadows, where the Gestapo asked them to turn turn on their organization and tell what they know, which under torture people sometimes did. He doesn't take it that far. He stops at moments that are convenient for commercial fiction to preserve the heroism of conscience. Sometimes their missions go wrong, of course, but they always survive, and the implication is that they're more committed to the fight, that they're going to carry on, and they are on a good thing. They know that they've made the right choice, and they're going to continue with this struggle against evil. I gotta pause there. Picking up from that, the Alan Furst heroes have chosen their side and found a position where they can make their opposition meaningful, usually by joining some sort of underground organization. They've done this usually for a combination of personal reasons and abstract reasons, usually some feeling of personal loyalty to the people that they're helping or trying to help them. Sometimes it's, I don't want to let this person down. They'll think less of me, sort of situation. And usually some version of abstract principle as well, though it's not always expressed. It's some sense of being dishonored, or if they didn't try to oppose fascism, some sense that this is just what you do in dark times, that you believe in kindness and compassion, and so you should help when you can. The ones where the characters are sort of the most happy with what they're doing are usually when they're helping someone directly, maybe helping someone escape Germany or an occupied country, or helping someone get the proper paperwork so they can get across a border. But there's usually some version of abstract principle, like when people need help, this is what you do. What the Nazis are doing is bad, and so opposing them is good. This combination of abstract principle versus sort of personal relations is at the heart of the Doctor Who episode mentioned earlier, the one about Pompeii. The Doctor has established an abstract principle, which is some events are fixed and you don't interfere with them, even if it was for really, really good ethical reasons. He doesn't give a lot of back explanation or backstory for why this is, but he does care about it deeply, and he does defend it as the reason why he's not going to save this family or warn the town of Pompeii that the volcano's about to erupt. But as the episode goes on, his companion Donna, who is sort of like the stand-in for conscience, and as these people are, the smoke and the lava have begun, and these people are facing the real end. They're really facing death, and the Doctor is leaving in his time machine with Donna, and Donna just sort of quietly says, "Help them." And, the actress is very good and manages to imply a lot just with this simple line, which is basically, living people sometimes are more important than abstract principles like protecting the timeline or fixed moments in time. And the Doctor hears this, and he returns and he saves this family. So in this instance, the call of personal relationships wins out over the call of abstract principles. Donna's request to him to save these specific people, to help this specific group of people, over his determination to not interfere with fixed points in time, wins out. And there's no real suggestion that anything suffers because of it, that the tragedy of Pompeii still happens, of course. It's just that this little group of people are spared. At the end of the episode, we find out that this little group of people has made a household god out of the Doctor. They've made a little statue that they keep in their hallway and they pray to. I think they were called Lares and Penates, these Roman household gods. People often react to the Doctor in the show. They often interpret his appearance in their reality as a sort of benevolent supernatural agent. He's described as an angel at least once in one episode, The Girl in the Fireplace, and I'm sure in others people see him as sort of a benevolent spirit, and in this case even even a god. But of course that is kind of what you would expect of a god. Many people do, is that whereas the god might set up the abstract principles that run the world, that when it came to it, God would break those rules to help people, to assist people. Thus you get sort of the consistent belief in miraculous interventions, miraculous healings, miraculous salvations that is doing just fine. That belief is widespread and continuing well today, even though it is not always clear how that belief would line up with a belief in creation, a creation with rules established by God, but which apparently God is able to break. So similarly, the Doctor defends this rule of a fixed moment in time, but then breaks the rule, at least in a modest way, in order to help this group of people when it's requested by the person he cares about and who he has a strong personal relationship with, his companion Donna. The Doctor often uses his companions, his human companions, sort of as like an exterior conscience or an exterior reminder to himself about how to behave. For some reason he's picked human beings as the ones best suited to do this, but it happens a lot, especially in the newer show, where they imply that like the Doctor's sort of tremendous perspective and experience on time and space has distanced him or her and made him difficult for him to take correct actions, and so being able to see things through the eyes of a normal human being, well, normal, but a human being helps him to make better decisions and to be more how he wants to be in the world. In the Ninth Doctor, the one played by Christopher Eccleston, near the end, he implies that it was his human companion Rose, who sort of recalled him to himself after the traumas of the Time War had left him feeling very cynical and burnt out and just kind of chasing action and excitement without much concern for the consequences. He implies that it was like Rose's more straightforward human ethical and moral perspective that recalled him more to the person that he wanted to be. So let's get to this thing about abstract versus personal, because it has a lot to do with what we would call fixing the past or taking correct actions in the present. I think it's reasonably safe to say that most people take their moral and ethical actions from personal relations, from the people around them who had a strong influence on them, sometimes people they know, sometimes ones they don't, who they imitated growing up and who they learned from on sort of like the deepest level. It doesn't mean that they imitated them slavishly, but they took sort of the general tone and approach to ethical and moral questions, to those questions about what do we do now, how do we improve the future, how do we fix the past, how do we act in the present. They took that from the people around them, and it's usually based on personal relations. However, I think it's also safe to say that most people have some version of abstract principles that they carry through and that form an impact on their life and then on those around them. And these principles, are not always very complicated, and there aren't always very many of them, but there's usually something that people are willing to ascribe to. They don't always integrate easily with each other. Sometimes they leave big gaps. It's probably safe to say all of us have gaps in our abstract principles because we're not constantly checking on them. We're not in a position where we need to. We need principles that kind of work roughly well enough in day-to-day life, and the rest we often leave to the philosophers. Isn't that something people used to say? I'll leave that to the philosophers. Uh, the philosophers are generally interesting people to leave things to, since they are the people who have kind of been entrusted with um, abstractifying questions, taking them out of personal relationships. Philosophy is sometimes said trying to create the view from nowhere, where a generic, non personified human being might look out at the world and what conclusions they would draw. I would say philosophy is also trying to create one way you can use philosophy. Maybe that's a better way to put it. One way you can use philosophy is to investigate things impersonally. I think John Rawls used a concept called the veil of ignorance, where you pretend not to know the specific nature of who you are, and in order to investigate questions and make determinations about what a just society would look like without knowing exactly what qualities would sort of best suit you and best privilege you. I would say, trying to create investigate questions impersonally, without regard for specific cultural traits that influence ethical and moral decisions right now in an inadequate, not fully just society. How could we live in a utopia? What traits would be essential and what wouldn't? It's pretty easy and obvious to say that philosophy hasn't really lived up to this. They've pretty much always unconsciously assumed various traits, or limited the number of people engaged in the philosophical project, so that the questions they investigate are artificially narrow. These are problems with the project, but I'm not sure they're problems with the goal of the project. And they are problems that are redressable by expanding the number of voices and questions that can be asked, and by treating more and more groups of people with philosophical seriousness. Uh, one show, skipping to another show from Dr. Who, one show that does well with this is The Good Place, a show that just went off the air a couple of years ago, 4 seasons on NBC. And it did a good job of using this tension between personal relations and abstractions as a motor for its story. In The Good Place, there is a character who is a moral philosopher named Chidi, and Chidi is quite good at abstractifying questions and considering them impersonally, because it's what he did for a living. And the other characters, in different ways, are very good at doing things on a personal level and responding to things the way that quote-unquote normal people might. But they find themselves bumping up against problems that they need abstraction to resolve, and then they turn to Chidi, and Chidi will dig into his bag of philosophy and philosophical familiarities, and he will abstract the question for them, which then allows them to discover a new angle, or a way forward, an idea, a way forward. There isn't a lot of the actual abstraction in the show. It's still a television show, and it's a sitcom at that, but they use abstracting a situation as a major element of the show, and it has actual impact on the story, and it's often presented as though this is essential to a good life and a good place, is the ability to abstract situations, reach for an abstract understanding of what's going on in order to assess them, and then apply that abstraction on the level of personal relations, which is what the other characters are good at. So with guidance from Chidi, they're able to apply what they've learned abstractly to real human beings, because they know these other real human beings and they're good at dealing with them as real human beings. It's implied, of course, that Chidi is not always great at dealing with real human beings, and that he needs to get better at that, but it's a comedy. And I enjoyed the tension. I always looked for the moment in the show when the problem of what's going on at that moment in the show is turned into abstraction and then transformed back, once it's been assessed correctly, transformed back into some element of personal relations. It was a very effective narrative device, and it made for a lot of fun, and it allowed for a lot of room for jokes and references and so on. Doctor Who, okay, it just occurred to me, I think I've fixed the problem of Doctor Who having like these fixed points and being unable to intervene in them. I think I've got it. Because, see, Doctor Who does not just travel in time personally, he has an actual vehicle, a time machine called the TARDIS. So if you're writing for Doctor Who and you're like, oh my gosh, this character is too powerful, how do I get around this obvious question of why he isn't going around fixing the timeline? Here's what you do. The time machine, the TARDIS, cannot operate without some fixed points in time by which to navigate. And all the main elements of the basic timeline that have led up to this moment are fixed points. And if those fixed points were to change, the TARDIS would stop working, or maybe it would explode. In general, the Doctor only uses the TARDIS once to like arrive at the spot of an episode and then go have an adventure, and then he returns to the TARDIS and he sort of sets off again. Every now and then he wants to like get in the TARDIS during the episode, but like the way is blocked, or the TARDIS has been captured, or there's a great old episode where the TARDIS has been put on a wagon and thrown down a mine shaft, and so he literally physically can't get to it, so he has to stay in this time and place until he can solve whatever's going on. So make it so that the TARDIS is linked to his ability to travel through time and space and do any of this good stuff is built upon accepting that many of these points are fixed. And then you could have some nice storylines where it's the TARDIS can handle a little bit of unfixedness and still operate, but it's not clear how much. So every time you alter a fixed point even a little bit, you risk damaging the TARDIS and damaging your ability to navigate through time and space. And that could lead to some fun, tense storylines where like there's something that's really important that the Doctor really needs to do, but if he does, he risks, destroying the TARDIS and stranding himself at a particular spot in time and space, which for him might as well be death. They often imply he more or less lives for bopping around the timeline and having fun. Yeah, that's how you solve it, writers of Doctor Who. There you go. I did a good thing that probably doesn't affect much of your audience, but something I always think of when I watch your show, and I appreciated you tangling with it in the Pompeii episode, and now I've just worked up a thing that you can play around with and have some games with this idea, and maybe put the Doctor through his paces. Okay, so abstraction. You might say there's like a move to abstraction. Going back to the Good Place, when the characters are encountering some sort of problem, some sort of ethical dilemma, or it's unclear what they should do, they go to Chidi, and Chidi moves the problem to the level of abstraction. It's the move to abstraction. It's neutral. It's not better or worse than using personal relations. People who like the move to abstraction often act like it's completely essential to correct ethical behavior. I'm not convinced of that. People who hate it often act like all it does is get in the way. I'm not convinced of that either. It's just a move you can make. You can move things to abstraction and depersonalize them and consider them using different categories, which all have different consequences. Which categories lead to which consequences? That's the study of philosophy, essentially. How do you code a problem? How do you coding, in this term being another term for abstracting, how do you abstract the problem? What are the relevant traits about the problem that need to be assessed? How do you assess them, and where do they lead you? These are the questions of philosophy that they're expected to dig into and to assess all the different elements of it. One of my favorite philosophy books makes its appearance right at the end of The Good Place. Chidi uses it during a key moment, and I was really happy about that. It's called Ordinary Vices by Judith Sklar, and I recommend it highly. It's a really good, not too long investigation of really, really common ethical problems, and it's written in a way that you don't need to be a philosopher to understand, and it takes very ordinary ethical problems very seriously, and it's helped me a lot. That's the point of the move to abstraction. It's to help you. If it helps to move to abstraction in a given moment, by all means, do it. Practice doing it, even when it's something not directly concerned, so that you can do it more easily. And also practice the life of personal relations. You need to get to know people really well. If it weren't for the people who, in The Good Place, for example, who understood the other characters and could relate to them well on a personal level, Chidi's abstractions would not lead to any better outcomes, because Chidi himself, it's presented, is not good at uh, actually putting these abstract ideas into play. You have to actually connect with people and figure out the specific ways in which that abstraction will best solve their problems and appeal to them. Okay, this is a lead up to uh, arguments, especially about important issues. When you are, that's very vague. I'm not sure what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to transition to say that um, there is an increasing move in discussion and argument of issues, both personal and social and political, which I'm going to call pseudo abstraction. Most of the time, appeals are made on personal levels. People get to know a certain person and they say, oh, if so and so, is for or against this, then I'm for or against it, depending on what I think of them. And what I think of them will be conditioned by what I know of them. So the more I know about them, the more subtle and detailed my take can be, even if I really don't think much of them. I can use it as sort of a contrarian indicator, and I can build my opinion more subtly because I know a lot about them. Uh, but you do get people who seem to intend to make abstract arguments and to abstract situations, but they don't do this in good faith. They don't do this with the intention of following the implications of your or their abstractions. They tend to either revert to personal relations, to not define their terms, and they're doing this partly to exhaust your interest. I don't say they're doing this consciously, but the end result is it exhausts your interests in abstract argument. And the goal seems to be to create a purely personal relations world where you're with us or against us. You're with the group arguing, therefore you are for the argument. Or you're against the group argument, therefore you're against the group argument. And this process seems to have advanced really far. And it's very dangerous, because without abstraction as a guide to what we should do, we're left with pure personal relations. And pure personal relations means that when they fail us, we have nowhere to go. So we're very easily manipulated, potentially, by bad actors among our circle. If we do not have principles that limit us, abstractions, I'm saying, abstract principles that limit our own action, that limit our behavior, similar to the doctor's determination not to interfere with fixed points in time. If we do not have that, then the field is so open that it makes it very difficult to take any action. Limits and constraints are important in order to take effective action. Similarly to, say, refereeing in a sport, there have to be fouls, there have to be limits on the amount of strength and aggression that players can do, or the sport cannot emerge because people will just deck each other. It seems common nowadays in politics in the United States that people are more or less making lists of good actors and bad actors, and they're doing this basically on the basis of their own personal relationships with them, either for or against. And then anything that those people are for or against follows from that association. And then the idea being that instead of exploring argument and abstraction, which does have its dangers, but right now is sorely lacking, instead of exploring those things, we're simply going to silence or eliminate the speakers, and then the abstract principle in some sense will disappear, because what matter a principle or a word if no one will speak it or speak up for it? This is partly why it's very important to build structures that bring automatically bring abstract principles and safeguards into play, and to have people who are considered trustworthy neutral arbiters, like referees in sports, people who are trusted to apply the rules neutrally to both parties, without the idea of the referee or of all referees being personally interested in the outcomes of the games rather than the application of the rules. The sport itself loses quality. If you can just deck people in basketball without a foul, pretty soon you won't have a lot of players, and the quality of the play goes down and it becomes less fun to watch. The end result of this is fewer people having the resources to play the game, because a less fun sport with less fun, with less safeguarded principles, with less positions that people can occupy without having to pay a high psychic cost in terms of their personal relations, the fewer people will be able to play. And that seems to be where we're headed in the United States with politics, where only a few people will have the resources, which can be quite elaborate, entire political action committees with staff, think tanks, causes, huge sums of money. This is the consequence of political inequality and plutocracy that we're dealing with. Is, although quite a lot of people in the United States do feel the obligation to play the game of politics, and many of them want to play it on the level of abstract principles. They vary on what those abstract principles are, but quite a lot of them understand that they're an essential part of the game, but they don't have the resources to play it. They don't have the resources to play it without paying too big a price in terms of their personal relationships with their communities, their own psychic happiness, psychological happiness, their self-esteem, their sense of what's right in the world. And so without the resources to play it, they play it badly. The people who have the resources to play it are playing it quite well, and they're shifting the nature of the game in order to make it easier for people like them to play the game. And they're leaving the rest behind. And this would be my critique of suggestions that we need more civics education, or that people are not feeling connected to political issues in the way that they used to. It's like, no, the game has shifted away from most of the country. The vast majority of the country no longer has the resources to play. What they do have are the resources to spectate, because spectation is a lot easier. In spectation, the gratification is vicarious, and you mostly sit down. So it's not that hard to do. You cheer for when you win, you bemoan when you lose, you blame the referees sometimes, and as you spectate harder and harder, if you will, the players get positive feedback for what they're doing, and they want to do it harder, and they create more room for the game to continue to deteriorate in quality. The move to abstraction for some players is important, and because of that, in order to protect the sport of politics, the spectatorial aspect of it, you create a web, and this is done by all sorts of people. It's not like just one side or something. It's just something that's emerged. You create a web of pseudo-abstraction where people intend to retreat as quickly as possible back to the spectatorial personal relations view, but they understand that you have to use the language of pseudo-abstraction from time to time without really meaning it. It's sort of like a tribute, like a little bit of a ticket that people will buy in order to play a slightly different part of the game that isn't a game anymore. I think I may be losing the thread of what I'm talking about. Is that really a problem? What am I talking about? I'm talking about the talking about social and political life no longer governed by the consequences of either abstraction or personal relations, about a continual tension between the two, and a huge array of fake personal relations, pseudo-social relations, pseudo-personal relations, and pseudo-abstraction, filling the gap between these two spaces. Sort of like chasing different dreams at the same time. You will find yourself with more and more gap to cross in order to wake up.